When you usually ask people about their favorite psalm, you don't usually hear Psalm 20. You hear Psalm 23, you hear Psalm 46, Psalm 91, of course, Psalm 27, but very seldom. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that Psalm 20 is their favorite psalm. But it may become one of your favorites today after we go through it, because it is a strong word of encouragement. Now, the theme is not difficult to identify in this psalm. It is a prayer for victory. That's the theme of the psalm. It's a prayer for victory. Now, we know that there was some kind of trouble that David was in, because let's know this is a Psalm of David, because we see that in the superscripture. However, we know that there was some trouble because in the very first verse, he says, "May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble." So we see that there was some problem. We go to verse 9, last verse in the psalm. "Save, O Lord, may the King answer us in the day we call." But like so many psalms, it's difficult to identify the occasion for the psalm. We just know that it was a time of trouble. If you note how you divide the psalm up, verses 1 through 5 is the first division. The second division would be verses 6 through 8, and then verse 9. That's the division. The first division, verses 1 through 5, you have the people pray for the king. That's the people are praying for their king. From verses 6 through 8, you have the king speaks. And then in verse 9, you have a summation. So apparently, the king has gone off to battle. Maybe the enemy has invaded Israel and the king is leading a defensive war to protect the city of Jerusalem. We don't know if it was the Ammonites, the Amalekites, the Philistines, or some other Canaanite tribe. But we know that the people are praying for the king, their king. And by the way, in antiquity, unlike today, when there was a war, the king was the general who led the war. He was not someone who sat on the sidelines. But let us note in verse 1, what said, "May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob set you securely on high." Why is he referred to Jacob? Well, I think it would probably be fair to say that this is a prayer of Jacob, because you see the exact similar words in Genesis chapter 35, verse 3. This is how it reads in Genesis 35, verse 3, Jacob speaking, "And let us arise and go to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God who answered me in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I have gone." I want you to note that, okay? The word distress that's used there in Genesis uh, 35, verse 3. Well, that's the same word that's translated in our text as trouble. The Hebrew word is zarah. That's Tzarah. And this word means distress. So what was the prayer of Jacob? Jacob was giving God thanks because when Jacob was in trouble, God delivered him. But I want you to note what Jacob says in his prayer. He says, and you have been with me wherever I have gone. I want you to look at that. Notice that. You have been with me wherever I have gone. It is not that Jacob is asking God to show up. What he's saying is that God has always been there. Listen, he was there for Jacob when Jacob had to flee from his brother who was going to kill him. He was with Jacob when Jacob contracted to work for Laban and was cheated. He was with Jacob on his journey when Jacob encountered the angel and wrestled with him. He was with Jacob when he brought him back into the land. So what Jacob is saying is that you've always been with me. So this is the prayer that we have in Psalm 20. This is a Jacob prayer. Jacob prayer is this: God, I want you to deliver me out of my distress or my troubles. But it implies this: you are there, God, you are with me. You know, in verse 2, if you know, it says, may he send you help from the sanctuary and support you from Zion. Well, some people say that seems to be a contradiction from what we have in verse 6, where it says, now I know that the Lord saves his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand. They say, well, which one is it? Is it in the sanctuary on the earth, or is it in heaven where God is? And I want you to know that there is no contradiction, because in verse 2, when he describes the heaven, when he describes the sanctuary, he's actually describing heaven. It goes along with what we have in Psalm 11, verse 2. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold, his eyelids test the sons of men. So I want you to know that when the people pray, they are praying to God who is in heaven. And do you know something here? It says in verse 3, may he remember all your meal offerings and find your burnt offerings acceptable. What is this business about the offerings? Well, the burnt offerings in particular were done to make atonement for sin. Leviticus 1:4 says, he shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, that it may be accepted for him to make atonement on his behalf. The king knows he is a sinner. That's the key. The king knows that. And so what did the king do? He realized he needed grace. You need grace in order for God to hear your petitions. It is a gracious act on God's part to hear. But the first thing that the king did was make it right with God. You know, you can't have peace with God until you get right with God. You know, that's exactly what the Apostle Paul said in Romans chapter 5, verse 1. Having been justified by faith, we have peace with God. After you get justified, you got peace. And the peace means that the war between you and God is over. You are at peace. Well, so what did the people ask God for? They asked God, according to verse 4, to make their king victorious. Look what it says. May he grant you your heart's desire and fulfill all your counsel. In other words, make him victorious in war. And in fact, why do the people pray like this? It is not merely because they love their king, but it is also because their fate is tied up in the king. If the king is victorious, they will be victorious. If the king falters and fails, if the king loses the battle, they will lose the battle. So they know that their fate is tied up in the king. That's why they say in verse 5, we will sing for joy over your victory. And in the name of our God, we will set up our banners. May the Lord fulfill all your petitions. I want you to note that they recognize that the king, if he's victorious, they will be victorious. And they said, we will celebrate when the king is victorious. You know, I don't know every problem that everyone is experiencing right now. But I do know this. You all have troubles. Some of you are in constant pain. Some of you have lost a loved one, a husband, a wife, a child. Some of you, you've had husbands who've left you or wives that have left you. Some of you are facing disease or some kind of debilitating illness. I don't know exactly what it is, but I want you to do this. When you are facing difficulties, I want you to use verses 1 and 2 as your benediction. You say out loud, may the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob set you securely on high. May he send you help from the sanctuary and support you from Zion. That should be your prayer. No matter what the difficulty is that you are going through. And I want you to know that as a result of these prayers, look at how the king responds in verse 6. He says, now I know that the Lord saves his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand. The king expresses absolute confidence in the saving power of God. He knows that the people have lifted him up. And so he says that he knows for sure. You know, the Hebrew is very not that clear whether this should be expressed, the word save should be expressed in the present tense or in the past tense. In the Greek translation, it's clearly the aorist, the past tense. And I believe that's probably the case. The king knows even before the victory that he has the victory because of the prayers of the people. In fact, look at what he says in verse 8. They have bowed down and fallen, but we have risen and stood upright. In other words, he has absolute confidence. So you know what? No matter what you're going through, you will face difficulties in your life. But what I'm saying is have confidence in the king. This is why we should know we have a different situation. They prayed for victory, but our king has already been victorious. Let me repeat that again. They prayed for their king to be victorious, but our king has already been victorious. In Revelation chapter 5, verse 5, it says that the Lamb has overcome. And when did he overcome? Because he was slain. He overcame at the cross. So this is what I have to say to you. When you're going through hardships, do not fret and bow down. We have a risen Savior. So fret not yourself over the trials of this life, weary Christian, but look towards your victorious King. He is seated in the highest place in heaven. There is no test that you cannot overcome with the help of your King. There is no burden that you cannot bear without your victorious King who is next to you. He will not forsake you in times of distress. He has sealed you with the earnest of his Spirit and set you on high. The clouds may be dark and the sky may be gray, but he sits above the foreboding sky in heavenly places. There are no troubled waters that he cannot still. There are no ominous dangers that you face that he cannot rescue you from. There are no foes seen and unseen that he cannot vanquish. It is only for us to trust in the God of our salvation because he is seated in the right place. And because he is seated in the right place, that is next to the majesty on high, I can have confidence even in the time of trouble. Why? Because he is my King. Now I want you to know, when you go down to verse 7, look at verse 7. It says, some boast in chariots and some in horses, but we will boast in the name of the Lord our God. In the New American Standard, it's translated boast. But this is literally how it reads in the Hebrew. Some in chariots, some in horses, but we, in the name of our God, will remember. And that's the way it's the King James uses the word remember. Because that word that's translated boast is used a number of times to mean to remember. It's used that way, for instance, in Genesis chapter 8, verse 9, when it says, but God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were in the ark. You find it in Genesis 15, verse 19. You find it in Exodus 19, verse 29. It is used over and over again to mean boast, but it also means something else. In 1 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 4, it actually means praise. This is the way it's translated. In 1 Chronicles 16, verse 4, he appointed some of the Levites as ministers before the ark of the Lord, even to celebrate and to thanks and to praise the God of Israel. There it's translated praise. Well, like others who look to their solutions or problems for human answers, you look to your victorious King. Why? Because he has already gained the victory. And when you go through hard times, just remember this. Jesus is the victor. He has already given you victory. Oh yeah, even if you don't see it, you don't have to trust in chariots and horses because he is the real King. You know, let me tell you, a lot of people saying, whoa, what are we going to do with this situation now with Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed, and they're going to put another justice on the Supreme Court who's going to obviously going to be conservative and going to do away with more rights for a number of groups. Well, what are you going to do about that? Well, just keep this in mind. Your King is on the throne. You keep that in mind. Your King is on the throne. You know, you may fret in the midst of all of these problems, but King Jesus rules. You know, you think about chariots and horses. Oftentimes, when the ancient battle took place, the very front line, they had the horses and chariots, the chariots driven by the horses going towards the enemy, because this was a formidable scene. This would cause terror in the hearts of the enemies, of the opponents, when they saw that. This was a frontal assault. Well, this is what David says. Our trust is not in the horses and chariots, but it's in our king. Now he's talking about a different king. Because if you look at verse 9, he says, save, O Lord. May the king answer us in the day we call. Now, he's not talking about David. Now he's talking about the true king who occupies the throne in heaven. And really, that's a summation of the whole psalm. In spite of the fact that Kenilworth Baptist Church is basically in obscurity around the world, unknown, we can't compete against cathedrals. We can't compete against mega churches. We can't compete against those churches with multi-million-dollar budgets, very impressive though they may be. Always keep in mind what the psalmist says, that we do not boast in chariots or horses, but our boast is in the name of the Lord our God. It's a big difference. God does not need cathedrals in order to make an impact in the world. All you need is someone who will trust him. And if you trust him, he can make the change. He can wrought about a change that the world will not believe. So I'm saying don't lose hope. Even in the midst of all of this chaos that's going on, the real king sits on his throne. The real king rules. The real king is sovereign, and the real king will have the last say. Amen.